Peace be upon you all, and welcome back to the channel where we have been doing a little mini-series covering Islam. Today is part number 3 in a series that I don't know how many parts it's going to have in total, but the first 2 we have covered a lot of the basics, some of the basic concepts and terms, and talked about the basic points of the faith and some of the important figures and pieces, components of the religion. Today, we're going to begin a little bit of a speed run through history. It's going to be a little slower in this video, but as we get to the end of this here and into the next video, it's going to rapidly pick up pace because we have a lot of ground to cover, because eventually I want to get us all the way. My real goal is to the West, bring that into the conversation, and specifically Islam's place in the United States today. But it would take, keep in mind, again, because it's going to be that quick coverage, I'm going to try to do as much justice as I can in a short, concise time frame here. But the topics that I will be discussing in each individual video alone, each video that I'm doing here, you could take and make, probably dozens of videos to do them their proper justice. So this is by no means a complete and exhaustive volume, but point number 1 today, we are going to be starting in pre-Islamic Arabia, just before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. So that is going to set the stage and to give you a little bit of context for the kind of world that he was entering into. And that brings me to point number 2, which is the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So we've mentioned him briefly before, but today we're going to revisit and go through the timeline of his life in a little bit more detail, because Muslims regard Muhammad as highly important is the understatement of the century. So there's a term, sunnah, which refers to example. I don't know if that's exactly the correct translation, but it refers to the example, the things he did, the things he said, the things he taught. All of that goes into the sunnah. So the Quran itself, remember, is chief, but then the sunnah is right under that. So that's going to include the hadith and all those things that really fill out the picture of the Muhammad. I guess in a sense he kind of is the Muhammad, but he is looked to. Think of kind of like, what would Jesus do? But if you're Muslim, it's what would Muhammad do? So that's kind of how they revere him, not as God, but as an example for human beings to try to imitate. So number 3, speaking of Jesus, number 3, I want to begin to do some comparisons between Islam and Christianity. And I think that's really going to help highlight certain key similarities, but also very important differences between the two systems. Because this idea that all religions are the same is insanely ridiculous. It is such a lie, and you will begin to see that more and more as we discuss here. I am obviously biased, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I don't have a dog in this fight. I do, but remember, I want to build my case on accurate information, so I'm not trying to just create a simple straw man here. I do have my critiques of Islam that will begin to trickle in over time, but I always want to balance that with a fair, accurate view. So if I want to disagree or criticize something about these ideas that I'm talking about, I want that to be because it's an actual disagreement on what it's actually teaching and not what it's being misrepresented as. So we're going to do kind of a side-by-side. We're going to cover Muhammad's life as Muslims regard him. We're going to cover a very brief review of Christ's life and how Christians view him. We may even talk a little bit about kind of the similarity, because there are some similar details between the Muslim Jesus and the Christian Jesus, or views of Jesus. But we are going to do kind of a compare-contrast between the two. And all that together is probably going to take up most of our time today. But if we do have any more time left over, we might start to get into the kind of the beginning of the expansion of what would become the caliphate, or the caliphate. But I imagine that will have to wait until the next video, so don't hold your breath on that. But I would just like to thank you for coming back to the channel today. I really appreciate you guys watching. If today's video ends up being a benefit to you, I would appreciate you leaving a like. If you, at the end of the video, I'm going to discuss some of what's to come. So if any of that interests you, or you want to just see more of this or support the channel, please subscribe. And if you're interested in following me, I do also have an X, formerly known as Twitter, that is active, and I will put that link in the description, and you can follow me over there. In time, I will start to kind of branch out into some of the other platforms, but for now, YouTube and X is where it's at. But I appreciate you guys again for watching, and I couldn't do this without you, so, but without further ado, let's get on with it. So, on the topic of Islam and what it is, so far, we've stayed fairly neutral. I've tried to be a little bit more fair and balanced. At least that's been my attempt. But like I mentioned today, you're going to start to see a little bit more of my criticism kind of trickle in here, because we are finished with dipping our toes in the water here. It's time to start getting a little bit more brave. It's time to start wading around in the shallow end of theory, and time to begin to wade or swim a little bit deeper into the waters of history, of Islam in action as it actually was and was actually carried out. So before long, though, not in today's video, we will finally arrive at the United States and how it concerns us today. But gentlemen, I will be frank. Islam's relationship with concepts like peace, freedom, equality, and human rights is a little complicated and even troublesome to a degree. While it does have its positive points, like compelling the faithful to care for widows and orphans, to give to charity, and it brought a sense of order and a sense of unity. Not a sense of, it did bring order and a sense of unity and a code of ethics to a region that didn't really have a lot of that going on at the time that it came onto the scene. So, but consider all that considered, it is also true that it has been linked to some rather unsavory practices in history and some dark moments in history. So it is not unique in that regard, but there might be some unique specific details, which we're going to begin to get into soon. So with that said, come with me, if you will, way back. Way back. We're going all the way back to roughly around the year about 2000 BC. So keep in mind that Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is the seal, the final of the prophets, but there are other very significant prophets. They recognize a lot more than just the small handful, but there's about 4, 5, or 6 very, very important prophets that are above all the rest. And one of those is Abraham, Father Abraham. So Abraham, this is where the term Abrahamic faiths comes from, because he's revered in both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. If you'll recall, God made his covenant with Abraham to make him the father of many nations. And he began that work with his 2 sons, the first being Ishmael by the servant Hagar, and the next being Isaac through his wife Sarah. So the Muslim faith, even though most people who are not Muslim would draw its beginning point around the life of Muhammad in the late 500s, early 600s, Muslims don't believe that's where Islam began. They believe, of course, God is eternal, so he's always existed, so it's a lot older in that sense, but they believe specifically it goes all the way back to the prophet Abraham. And they draw a direct connection to him in a way that we will discuss here in just a couple minutes. But the next major prophet in their lineup is Moses, as in the law of Moses, which is, in fact, what they believe God gave to him. And in this sense, remember, I'm talking about the Muslim concept of God here. So it's not the triune God. It's not, it's not Judaism's idea of the monotheistic God, but this is the Islamic version. So God gives the Torah, the law, to Moses, to the children of Israel. But over time, it begins to be corrupted by men. It's not just not followed, but it is in fact corrupted. So going on down the line, another prophet has to come along, and that is none other than Jesus of Nazareth. So now we're right at the split in the Gregorian calendar here. So around the year 5 BC up until 30 AD, as Christians understand his death and resurrection to have happened. But in this case, Jesus, or as the Muslims call him, Isa, was born into the world, and they do in fact believe that he was born of the Virgin Mary, that it was a virgin birth, and that he was preserved from sin in a way that other men were not. There's the belief that when a child is born in Islamic tradition, that Satan touches that child, and in a sense that is kind of the corruption, kind of the sinful nature that then affects that child. Well, if I recall correctly, it was kind of a quick note as I was doing my research, Muslims actually believe that Jesus and Mary, when Mary was giving birth to Jesus, that not just was an immaculate conception, so he has no earthly father, but that he was not touched by Satan, or Shaitan as they call him, but in fact he lived his entire life. In the Quran, doesn't particularly ascribe any one particular sin to Jesus, interestingly enough, in all its passages about him, because he is discussed in the Quran. But anyway, so that's a little foretaste of what's to come. So moving along here, we are going to get into the era of pre-Islamic Arabia, what is known by Muslims as the Age of Ignorance. All right, so I had to take a moment to attach my mic here real quick because I have brought a teaching aid today. I promise one day I'm going to learn to actually do this on the screen through some editing, but I have a map. That is the region of the Middle East. That is the Arabian Peninsula there, all around there. And during the Age of Ignorance, so there are a couple superpowers in the area. So just to kind of get you a little center point, these cities right here, Medina, and down here Mecca, in the Arabian Peninsula, what is today Saudi Arabia, those are going to be very, very important in our discussion about Muhammad. So just to kind of give you a reference point there. So up here, you have the Sasanian or Sassanid Empire. So that is Persia. So you got like modern day Iraq is in this area. You've got, modern day Iran in this area, what was called Persia for a long time. And then you have the other, so they're one superpower. Then you have this other superpower over here, which is the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, as you might hear. So those two are kind of the main players that they love to fight. That is their favorite thing to do to pass the time, is to expend tremendous amounts of manpower and resources trying to conquer one another and win influence over the region, over the other. And the Eastern Roman Empire at this point is Christian, so it's the mainstream Christianity, and there's not been the East-West split just yet. So we have gotten at this point, so it's about right before the year 570 AD. So there have begun to be a number of churches kind of dividing themselves from the main church, the ancient church, and you got like the Church of the East, and what today we call the Oriental Orthodox churches. So they have, at this point, broken off and begun doing their own thing, and it's going to kind of come into play a little bit. But meanwhile, the Sassanid Empire is predominantly Zoroastrian. So that is another monotheistic religion that has, I'm excited to get into that one another day. I don't know if it'll be in this series because it's not really relevant to like the culture war in the United States. But I find learning about people's religious beliefs very interesting, very fascinating. So maybe in another series, on another day of the week, I will cover Zoroastrians and kind of how they compare to Christianity. But that is the religion of the day over here. And this region over here, so you can see there's something called the Ghassanids that are right there, just off the kind of the edge of the Eastern Roman Empire. Well, until recently, there was also another area that belonged to a group called the Lachemids. Lachemids? Sorry. Remember, I'm going off of notes here. I'm trying to be as accurate as I can be. But they are, these are two little, you could call them, I guess, client states. So they are kingdoms, but they, at least for times, certain amounts of time they are, but they are heavily influenced and directly kind of connected to the larger empires there. So the Ghassanids are with the Eastern Roman Empire, and they are an Arab nation. So they're ethnically Arab, but they are Christians, belonging to the... Where did I have that? Of course, oh, it's up here. Sorry. So the Ghassanids are an Arab state and kind of a buffer kingdom, and they are Miaphysites. So they are what today is one of the Oriental Orthodox churches, I believe specifically Syriac. Talk about that another day. But just know that they are a little bit different form of Christianity. They are still Nicene, so they still have the same foundation as the larger, what would eventually become the Roman Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. But they are a little bit different. But they are allies. But the Ghassanid kingdom serves ultimately the Eastern Roman Empire. And I'm going to prefer to call them the Romans because they are the continuation of the Romans. There's kind of some debate in academia as, do we call them the Eastern Roman Empire? Do we call them the Byzantines? Because where the site of Istanbul sits today, what was once Constantinople, used to be called Byzantium. And so they use that to kind of differentiate it from Rome proper. However, these people in this empire at this time viewed themselves as Romans. So I'm going to honor them that way. The other one, the Lakhmids, this is another group of Arab Christians. So even though they have at this point been absorbed into the Sassanid Empire, they are another Arab kingdom that is more connected to Persia. And like I said, at this point, they had been formally disbanded and just absorbed into the larger empire there. But they are predominantly the Church of the East, which is yet another different church. And they were kind of the Sasanian version of the Ghassanids. So these two kind of give the larger nations kind of some standoff, like I said, a buffer zone. But they also, all of this going on up here affects what is happening in the Arabian Peninsula. So that's kind of why I'm spending a lot of time on those. Some other important players, you got Aksum down here, or you might hear like Abyssinian mentioned. This is Ethiopia, basically. So this is yet another Oriental Orthodox Christian kingdom down here. And they are important because they at different times, of course, they're not far away, so there's some trade and different things going on here. But they also make some forays into the Arabian Peninsula. And at one point conquered this little area. So to kind of start to familiarize yourselves a little bit. So this area, this whole peninsula here, is largely arid desert, but there are some mountain ranges here and there. And there are some oases all over the place. And these little oases and the coastlines were the more habitable areas. The rest of it's a lot of desert and open terrain where there's a lot of roaming Bedouin nomad tribes. And down here in what is today Yemen, so you got Oman up here, you got the UAE here, Qatar, and some of the Gulf states, all around there. But Arabia proper, this whole area, down here in south, the southern area, there was a few different kingdoms. And most recently, there was what was called the Himyar Kingdom. And this area tends to be a little bit better developed, a little bit more united than, you got little exceptions, kind of city-states here, kind of like Mecca and Medina. But this is just the wildlands out here. This is a bunch of tribes that spend their free time and a lot of their business time conducting raids on one another. They are fiercely loyal. So you got this system of tribes that are broken up into clans, and then those clans are broken up into family units. And this is kind of reminds me of, if you know anything about like political science or political philosophy, Thomas Hobbes, if I remember correctly, he has this whole idea about the state of nature. And I know his thing is also the Leviathan, if I recall correctly. But he had this idea where absent a functioning government, there exists a state of nature, which is a quote-unquote war of every man against every other man. So that is sort of the state of affairs for this region here. there are different systems of honor. It's not that it's just utter chaos all the time, but there's a lot of rivalries between these different tribes and between the clans themselves. There's no central government. So there's no overarching authority that is keeping everybody in line. So this tribe is going to war with that tribe, and that tribe's conducting raids on that tribe, and raids are going to be a big part of history moving on here, because some historians have described it at this point in history as the national sport of the Arabians. So they raid one another for their horses, for their camels, for their other resources, and sometimes even for their women. So, and if such a thing was done to you, it then became your obligation, if you had survived such an encounter, to rally your clan, your tribe, and to do the same and worse to them. So vengeance was a huge thing at this time between these tribes. And so there's just this constant state of this Mad Max is kind of what it makes me think of these different warring tribes. And meanwhile, you got trade caravans trying to, make it through this area and get to places like Medina and Mecca, and to sell their goods and to make their money. And but to contrast all the tribal thing going on here, you do get these little islands of civilization going on, and there are structures. They have some kind of like local governments, but even there, you get a lot of this tension because a lot of the tribes, as they're out in kind of the wildlands doing their thing, at different times they are conducting, especially to Mecca, they are conducting pilgrimages, specifically to see something called the Kaaba. And we're going to talk about the Kaaba in a little detail in just a second. But these tribes are predominantly pagan. So not just that, put a pin in all that political situation. Let's talk a minute about the religious landscape of this area at the time. So, just before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula is really diverse. The paganism dominates. It's in the sort of paganism it's kind of a mix of, you got some like Mesopotamian type things, so like kind of like the Babylonian gods going on. But you also have some animism in there. You have some people just worshiping or regarding holding rites and rituals for like the stars and the moon and the different features of nature. There's all kinds of things going on. And Mecca is kind of the heart of a lot of this, because the Kaaba, and what the Kaaba is, today what you'll know it as is this building. It's this little, what Muslims believe was a small house of worship that was constructed by Abraham himself. And over time, people corrupted it. And it was originally, under Abraham, dedicated to the worship of the monotheistic God. And that is the next group that's going around doing their thing at this point in time. It are the monotheists, which are also called the Hanifs. Like I said, white Arabic words, I can only do so much. But monotheists at this time, they reject all of this pagan idolatry going on. However, they are not Jewish or Christian. So they don't follow those systems, but they long for the worship, and they try their best to worship what they believe is the one true God, as Abraham tried to worship him. That's kind of how the Muslims draw their distinction. So you'll see those monotheists kind of are a group that is ripe for a system like Islam to come along. And according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad himself was one such monotheist. So they don't believe that he was one of these pagans or these polytheists worshiping all these gods or worshiping all the different idols at the Kaaba. Oh, that's right. I need to get back to that. We'll get back to that in just a sec. But that he always worshipped the one God, even before he began to receive revelations. In the Quran, actually, is where we get some of this teaching that Abraham was one of these Hanifs, in Surahs 3:67 and 2:135, verse 135. So those mention Abraham, trying to offer proper worship. And built it with his son Ishmael. So that's another key detail there. And again, like I said, that's why Muslims believe that Islam is actually an ancient religion. It goes way back, way further than the life and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Kaaba. What is the Kaaba? I was saying it's this little structure. You've probably seen, if you've seen any images of Muslims doing their pilgrimage, it's this like black square. I think it's a cloth that's over it. It's covering like the stone that's underneath. Well, it's kind of like a little building of significant importance. It is the holiest site in all of Islam, in Islam's holiest city, Mecca. So this is what Muslims face when they pray. It's a symbol of unity. They do not worship it. It's kind of a focus. So they pray not to it, they pray through it to worship God, the true monotheistic God. Already mentioned, they believe it was built by Abraham and Ishmael. It also contains what's called the black stone. So on one of the corners, you kind of see as people try to get up and kiss it and rub it and all kinds of things like that. But they believe that Abraham didn't just build that structure, but he also put that black stone there as well. And over time, of course, this was corrupted, and up as many as 300, 360, who knows, maybe even more idols were placed in and around this Kaaba. And then it became, over centuries, a pagan site of worship. But eventually Muhammad does come along and corrects that issue, and he clears out all the idols and restores it to its proper worship of the one true God. So the rest of the groups real quick here, because I'm already spending a lot of time. Where is my notes on the religions? There we go. So, and interestingly enough, so as the Roman Empire came in and laid siege to and destroyed Jerusalem and the Jewish temple, the Second Temple, we had the great diaspora. So they spread all over the world. And one of those places that a lot of Jews ended up going to is down here in Arabia. So places like some of these oases and down in the south, kind of in that Kingdom of Yemen area, the city specifically of Medina, at the time was called Yathrib, but would soon be changed to Medina, had a significant presence of Jews in the area. As a matter of fact, a couple of the tribes there were completely Jewish, so they had some thriving communities in and around these different areas. So that would definitely be something that even before he began receiving revelation that Muhammad would become familiar with. There's also a Christian presence. So I kind of told you, kind of all the surrounding areas. So you got kind of some notable Jewish presence in this area, or at least specifically Medina and kind of down in the south here. The Christians are kind of everywhere else, kind of sprinkled about here and there. They're mostly Church of the East and Syriac Oriental Orthodox. And there's also some heretical groups running around there, some Gnostics and whatnot. And interestingly enough, that some of their scriptures, some of their teachings do show up in the Quran. So conversation for another day. And then, of course, you have the Zoroastrians, as you have this massive empire over here. So kind of up in this area, kind of in the east, you get some Zoroastrians trickling in there. So all these people are all intermixing here. Again, the pagans are kind of the majority group here, with everybody else kind of functioning in and around them. But Arabia was a fractured, diverse region in terms of religion and culture. And tribal warfare was rampant. The nearby warring superpowers sometimes put pressure on or influenced the region, which often added to the chaos. So sometimes the Sassanid Empire would push a little further into there. Sometimes, Eastern Rome would get a little brave. But anyway, so there's all this chaos for all this time. And so the stage was set for Muhammad and his unifying mission. All right. So now we're moving on to the life of Muhammad himself. So you guys ready? Here's where it's going to start to get kind of interesting. So the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. So he was born in the year 570. So that means Christianity has been alive and kicking for almost 600 years at this point. To give you a little context there. So Muhammad is born in the city of Mecca, which is, I'll use a little bit more accurate. So that's Mecca. So you got all the Arabian Peninsula. This city right here is Mecca. I don't know if that's too fuzzy to see or not. But he was born into the Banu Hashim clan, which I think Banu means clan, so that just might be redundant, but which is a part of the Quraysh tribe. Now, the Quraysh are, and he's also believed to be a descendant of Ishmael. The Quraysh are the powerhouse tribe in this city, and really the region. They are predominantly merchants, so they, send and control a lot of caravans that go all over the place and sell their goods. But they also control, I mentioned the pilgrimages earlier, a lot of the pagan pilgrimages that come into the city of Mecca to go worship at the Kaaba and do a bunch of other stuff. So they are, buying and selling, and, all this money is making them very powerful, wealthy merchants. So Mecca also sat on a number of significant trade routes. So they're all kind of routing into, as they're crossing this big expanse of wild desert lands, Mecca is an oasis where they can kind of rest and refit, or even just sell their goods there. And you got multiple different directions. Arabia kind of sits in the middle. You got Africa on one side. You've got the rest of Asia on the other. You even have some lands that are getting close to Europe up north. They're right in India over there to the east, not too terribly far away. So they are smack in the middle of a lot of that. So they're kind of a crossroads there. So he's born into this family, and his dad dies before they believe he, fully man, so there's no immaculate conception going on here, but his father dies before he's born, and then his mother sadly passes away when he was only 6 years old. So he's orphaned at age 6. And at the time, his grandfather is the head of the clan, the Hashim clan, and takes him in, but soon after, at only age 8, he loses his grandfather too. So it's at this point that his uncle, who's a very important figure in his life by the name of Abu Talib, takes him in, kind of adopts him, and takes him under his wing, protects him, and begins to raise him. So from age 8 onward, he is under his uncle, Abu Talib. And he begins working as a shepherd, which is pretty common for Arabian boys at the time. And I'm sure a lot of them to this very day, where he, learned some early discipline and hard work by herding goats and sheep. So as he grows up a little bit, he begins working as a caravan trader. So he's not just hanging out in and around the city of Mecca, but he begins to travel with his uncle as they start going all the way up into Syria and some other places. So down here at Mecca is where they're starting. They're following trade routes, and he gets all the way up here into, maybe this region. So at the time, Syria kind of extended further. It wasn't just, this region that we know it today right up here. It was kind of this whole area, what some people might call Palestine or Israel, or I'm not trying to get into that whole controversial topic right now. There's enough controversy as is. Anyway, so he starts going on these trips, and he begins to build a reputation for himself, of a good reputation, and earns himself some nicknames like Al-Amin, which translates to the trustworthy. And so people see he's a hard worker. He is honest. He, charges fair, honest prices. He doesn't cheat people. And he faithfully carries out these. So it's not always for themselves. Sometimes they're doing these caravans on behalf of other people. And he's building and building and building this reputation for himself. So much so that in the year 595, so we're almost at 600, the year 595, when Muhammad is 25 years old, he is noticed and hired by a rich widow, Christian widow at the time, named Khadijah. So Khadijah is 40 years old and hires him to bring some of her goods up to Syria and sell them there. And she is so impressed by his performance that actually proposes marriage. And so the 25-year-old Muhammad and the 40-year-old Khadijah are married. And I don't mean to be weird about that with the ages. That is an okay age gap, I guess. It's kind of it's kind of flipped what you would normally expect. But that's not as troublesome as something else that we're going to talk about a little later. But they are married, and I guess Khadijah bears him multiple children, even though she's already 40 years old. And one of those children is his daughter named Fatima. And Fatima is significant because I believe she's the one that marries his cousin, Ali. And Ali, sorry, I know I'm throwing out some names here. You may not be familiar with these types of names. She's going to be important later on. Probably not in this video. We'll talk about that another time, though. But he, at this time, is faithfully monogamous to Khadijah. So the two of them are happily married. And even at a time that polygamy was common, he does not marry. He does not take for himself any other wives or concubines at this time. For the entirety of Khadijah's life, they are a faithful, happy couple. Fast forward a few years, in the year 610. So he himself now is 40 years old. You know, Khadijah would be 55 at this time. He, you know, as he's doing his work, at different times he would retreat to the outside of the city, into some of the caves. He would, you know, pray, meditate, whatever it is that he's doing, you know, just getting some time to himself to kind of center himself. And all of a sudden, an angel appears to Muhammad. The angel Gabriel appears and begins to command him to recite. And Muhammad is understandably startled. And it's not clear. I was trying to find the sources here. I'm still learning, like, what are good sources, what are bad sources with some of these Arabic sources. There was a telling at this point. There was a telling of this interaction. So this is where the revelations begin, where he first begins receiving the surahs, which would be eventually compiled into the Quran. But in some tellings, he is told to read, because I guess the Arabic word for recite and read is the same thing. So there is a version of the story where he is told to read. And Muhammad says, I can't. I don't know how to read and write. You know, he's illiterate. And I don't say that to insult him, because that wasn't uncommon of the day. But he's told to read, and he says, I can't read. Well, that seems to, I don't know if it annoys Gabriel or if he's just trying to make a point here, but it says he begins to squeeze the prophet. So I guess he's got him, like, wrapped up, and he starts to, like, you know, squeeze him in some kind of bear hug and tells him, read. And Muhammad said, I already told you, I can't, man. Like, I don't know how to read. And so he squeezes him again, and, you know, he's terrified. He doesn't know what's happening. And so this happens 3 times until finally he begins to recite. Well, in kind of another version, it kind of skips over those details. And it's just Gabriel comes in, tells him, hey, recite. And he begins to receive revelation from God through the angel Gabriel. And, you know, commits it to memory, and then would go on and share that with people who would become his followers. So I don't say that to confuse you guys, but that's just to acknowledge that there's some details that maybe in the future I will have enough time to really research it and understand. I would love to recover all this again in the future, but he is frightened. He's terrified after this encounter. And so he runs home and is, you know, jumping into his wife's lap, you know, telling her, cover me. I'm terrified. You know, he has to kind of collect himself. Well, Khadijah comforts him and she reassures him. He tells her the whole story, and she's like, no, this is incredible. Like, you know, Gabriel's telling him, you're the apostle of God. You are this prophet. And this is a lot to take in all at once. So she takes him to go see her cousin, who's an elderly man at this point, supposedly another elderly Christian, and the 3 of them discuss and basically reassure Muhammad that, no, you have to go back, because this is a big deal. You are a very, very special, you have a special mission here. God has chosen you. So he does, and he begins to receive the revelation. So this becomes a theme where Muhammad will retreat, he will receive revelations, and he will come back and deliver another surah. So you count the surahs in the Quran, you know, reasonable to assume. I don't know if it was 114, because there's 114 chapters or surahs. I don't know if it's 114 separate occurrences of this, or if maybe there was more than one that was given at a different time. But this is the process that happens. And it doesn't just happen at Mecca. It continues to happen throughout the rest of his life. So into Medina. And that brings up something that I want to talk about in just a second. But so as he begins to preach, he doesn't do so publicly. So this is still very new. So he preaches privately. So kind of family member, kind of behind closed doors. Khadijah becomes one of his early converts and some of his family and close friends. So he preaches privately for about 3 years. So from about 610 to about 612 or 613, depending on how you count it. And his following is very, very small. But something changes because God tells him, okay, man, you've got your foot in the door here now. You need to take this message public. And that's when the trouble begins. So, quick note on the transmission of the Quran. So as I mentioned, Muhammad couldn't read or write. So he memorized what he was told, and then he recited it to his followers. Now, his followers during his lifetime, they were writing this down, and they wrote it on all kinds of materials that they could get their hands on. So palm leaves, animal bones, stones, leather, whatever they could get their hands on. But it wasn't assembled into one unit as we know it today. That didn't happen until his successor, Abu Bakr, who was a close companion and father-in-law to the Prophet Muhammad. So shortly after Muhammad passes away, he's like, we have to compile this because we don't want to lose this. This is, we've lost Muhammad. We want to preserve this for generations to come. So he, under his order, and we'll talk about the successors in the next episode, but he's the first caliph, successor to Muhammad. And so he gives the order and they compile all these into one. And then a later successor by the name of Uthman. So that happens in the year 632, which is the year that Muhammad passes away. And then after Uthman, so about 18 years pass, in the year 650, who is another close companion of Muhammad, but he is actually his son-in-law. So Abu Bakr was his father-in-law, so Muhammad was married to his daughter, and Uthman is Muhammad's son-in-law, so he is married to one of Muhammad's daughters. So Uthman standardizes it. So as people are starting to kind of mess with it and start to create their own versions of it, he says, nope, this is how it's going to be. This is the Quran. Everything else gets destroyed. So that is why Muslims assert that they have only one version of the Quran. And as we mentioned in previous episodes, it's not really the Quran unless it's in Arabic, because that is the language that God chose to reveal the Quran to Muhammad in. So that is truly the true Quran. There are translations of the Quran, as one that I could read in English today. But so moving on. So he begins to preach publicly. And at first it's, he's keeping it very, he's not saying anything super controversial at first. So he doesn't meet a lot of resistance at first, but then he begins to condemn the idols. Then he begins to speak out and really hammer home that there is only one God. If you remember the Shahada, this is the very heart of Islam, that there is only one God. There's no other God but God. And Muhammad is that God's messenger. So that is Islam summed up into one brief sentence there. So he begins to share this message. And the Quraysh, the elites, that rich tribe that rules this land, they took that personally. So Muhammad and his small following begin to endure increasingly disturbing and horrific persecution. So it starts out with just simple ridicule, harassment, but people, as they get more and more perturbed at his message, they begin to boycott him and his followers. So at this time, Abu Talib, his uncle, is continuing to protect him. So, protect, basically meaning like, do not come for Muhammad, don't attack him, because if you do, we'll fight you back. So he is under Abu Talib's protection at this time, but they are starting to endure some troubles, particularly Muhammad's followers. So they are banned. A lot of these tribes ban them from trading with them or from intermarrying with their tribes. So they're losing out on economic and social opportunities here. Some followers are taken and beaten. They're taken and tortured. I think I read one was like put in like a hot suit of armor in like the blazing hot sun in the middle of the day. And so like the hot metal was on his bare flesh and, just horrific stuff. People, all the creativity of the brutal periods of history. So that's what these people begin to inflict on his followers. So, and they even have their first martyrs. So a couple are They're trying to get these guys to recant, and they're tortured to death, and it's a bad time. So such a bad time that some actually end up fleeing Mecca and running to Christian Ethiopia, the Abyssinian kingdom empire. I probably said that wrong. So times are not good. And but some other things, some extraordinary things start happening. So Muhammad experiences something called the night journey during the course of all this. And what the night journey is a very important story. So this is one of, I don't know exactly how many miracles are attributed to Muhammad. If you're familiar with Jesus, you know that there are a lot of miracles that are associated with Jesus. He was doing them all the time, left, right, and center. Muhammad doesn't seem to be doing that. He seems to be mostly functioning as a regular dude, but there are exceptions. There are certain miracles that are attributed to Muhammad, and this night journey is one of the biggest. So there was, from what I was reading, there's a little debate over whether this really truly was a physical bodily thing that happened or if it was just a dream. But the story obviously has more impact if it was a bodily event. So Gabriel shows up with this winged creature called the Buraq. It was kind of like a Pegasus, but there's with some subtle differences there. But he accompanies Muhammad, and he picks him up from Mecca and takes him to the city of Jerusalem. And they land in around the area where today there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Dome of the Rock is, that golden domed mosque on the top of the foundation that used to be the Jewish temple. So the story goes in this that Muhammad experiences this and is with Gabriel, but he meets the other prophets that we mentioned earlier. So he meets Abraham and Moses and Jesus and all those three. So they talk together, but then they begin to pray together and praying in the Muslim manner. And notably, Muhammad is selected to lead that prayer. He serves as the imam, the leader for that prayer session. And for the Muslims, practically, so a couple things here. So this results in beginning the practice of daily prayers, the 5 daily prayers. I don't think it was all 5 at first, but this at least starts the practice of daily prayers. And at first it was oriented toward the city of Jerusalem for the Muslims. But notice how I described that Muhammad was chosen to lead those prayers over Abraham, over Moses, over Jesus, who the Muslims do not believe is fully man and fully divine. They believe he was only man. But that is to put an emphasis on Muhammad's station, on his role. And it shows that he has supremacy over all the others because he is the seal, the ultimate prophet that has given God's final word, his true word in the Quran. And then after they have this experience, he goes to heaven, which is multiple layers, 7 layers, I believe, and meets some more prophets and kind of witnesses what heaven is like. And he is then at the end of it returned to Mecca. So this is a incredible story that is mentioned in the Quran, but it's expanded upon in the Hadith and some of these other writings that come after and that are separate from but support the Quran. But the Quran does mention it. So moving back to the events in Mecca. So in the year 619, I believe they call it the Year of Tears. So 610, he begins receiving revelations. He starts preaching and then starts preaching publicly. So 619, he's been a prophet for 9 years now. He loses both his wife Khadijah and his uncle Abu Talib. So things go from bad to worse. Because not just does he lose both of those and is devastated, but his clan, he has another uncle that takes over headship of the clan. And this uncle, I think Abu Lahab, something like that, something close, something Lahab. But he does not like Muhammad, and he removes the clan's protection of Muhammad. So now it wasn't just his followers, now Muhammad's life is in danger because he's basically told the rest of the Meccan tribes, hey, he's free game. So they start looking for other options. They start questioning what the future of this little movement's going to be. Well, as it would so happen, a representative from the nearby town of Yathrib at the time, so recall all these things are happening in Mecca. Jerusalem's up there, about somewhere in there. So that's the night journey. But then from up here, so Mecca down here, Medina, or at the time Yathrib, is right there. So it's about 200 miles, if I recall correctly, so to the north. And they say, hey, we know your work. You've done good work. We've been listening to your message. We kind of like it. We got some trouble going on up here in Medina, and we understand you have some trouble going on here in Mecca. Well, why don't you come up and lend us a hand? We'll give you safe harbor. We'll give you a place to live, a place to kind of set down roots. So he takes him up on it, and he sends in small groups. He begins to send out his followers in little groups, kind of in the cover of night, and they begin to migrate up to the city of Medina. And Muhammad is the last, along with his companion Abu Bakr, he is the last to leave the city of Mecca. And Gabriel warns him of an impending assassination attempt on his life. So Muhammad narrowly dodges an assassination attempt by the Quraysh, and then he himself, with his last remaining couple of companions, slips out and makes what is called the Hijra, or the Hegira, in the year 622 up to Medina. So this is an extremely important event because this is where the Islamic calendar begins. So the year in the common calendar, the Gregorian calendar, the year 622, is actually year 1 for Muslims. And this is Muhammad's migration from Mecca north to Medina. So, something to talk about. The Quran does not have a New Testament and Old Testament like the Christian Bible does. But there are a couple of divisions here. And keep in mind, it's also not in chronological order. It's generally from like the longest verses down to the shortest, and they're kind of each like self-contained units. But there are Meccan verses, which are all the things that Muhammad received when he was living in Mecca, all the revelations that he received when he was in Mecca. And then there are Medinan verses, all the things that he received when he was in the city of Medina. And you're going to notice some differences here. So the Meccan period, the Meccan verses began in the year 610 when he first gets the first visit from Gabriel. These are shorter, more poetic surahs with intense calls to faith, with warnings and community building focused on individual conversion and resilience. So we're approaching a very significant thing that even non-Muslims have at least heard of, that I want to be very careful with. It is a big idea, so I will not be covering it exhaustively in this episode, but I will cover it over the course of the remaining episodes. We're going to continue to kind of build out the ideas behind this concept, and that, of course, is none other than jihad. So, at this time, so jihad is misunderstood as holy war. The word, so the question, what is jihad? So it is a simple question to answer and also a very difficult question to answer because there's a lot of disagreement and arguments over it. So jihad translates actually to struggle. And, but what does that mean? So, okay, that's what the word jihad means, but what does that mean? The struggle mean? Well, welcome to the fun of the debate because, there are two major divisions of it. There's what's called the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. And these ideas are kind of introduced through the Quran, through the Prophet Muhammad. The greater Muhammad is believed to be more, the greater Muhammad, the greater jihad is believed to be more of a spiritual thing. It is it's an internal thing. It's something that like Christians really would resonate with. And I found myself very much being like, oh, well, that sounds like what I would say that like part of the Christian life is about. Let me just read this little excerpt here. It says, defined as the internal personal struggle against one's own passions, evil impulses, and temptation to sin. It emphasizes moral, spiritual, and ethical self-improvement. It extended to verbal arguments and discourse or other attempts at persuading the pagan Meccans, or anyone else who's non-Muslim as it applies today, to submit to Islam. So you have those two big camps of jihad, so the greater and the lesser jihad, and we'll get to the lesser jihad here in a minute. But the greater jihad is the internal, the spiritual. And there's some subdivisions of each. So one of those things is proselytizing, is arguing, persuading. You might hear something like the jihad of the tongue. So it's, or of the pen, or something to do with spreading the message of, not too dissimilar from the Christian idea of evangelism, of going out and spreading God's word, of trying to call other people to repentance and to come to faith in Christ. This is kind of a Muslim version of that. However, there is also the lesser jihad. And what the lesser jihad is, we're going to get a bit more into the context of this, but this begins in the year 622, after the Hijrah. And let me just read it. So the doctrine of jihad evolves at Medina when Muhammad rises to power and war comes for him. The previously spiritual struggle became physical, starting as defensive in nature, as we see in Surah 22, verses 39 and 40. As Muhammad begins to command raiding parties and armies in defense of his new home and Ummah, the Muslim community. This doctrine would continue to develop until the Prophet's death. So, these are longer surahs in this Medinan period, with detailed legal and social guidance. There's a shift to building a stable society and expanding the faith of the community. So I know I haven't covered these events yet. We'll get right to it here after this, but I wanted to cover the Mecca, Medina verses and periods. So again, the Meccan period is from 610 when he receives his first revelation until 622 when he migrates to Medina. And then the Medinan verses are 622 until his death in 632. And yeah, so you have a lot more of like codes of law coming out there, but then you also notice a tone shift. So warfare becomes, the external struggle becomes a increasingly central focus. And understandably, listen, Christians have been a part of war. They still serve as soldiers. I was a soldier at one point. It's not that Christians can't participate in war or haven't done horrible things in the name of Christ, but it's why I wanted to do this video and then in the videos to come is to really kind of dig into this idea of jihad. That's kind of what motivated me to do these videos to begin with, is what is jihad? Like why do some say it's just an inward thing, and some say it's an external thing, but it's only defensive, and others still are like, no. It's spreading Islam. It's creating, the caliphate. It's, dominating the world until everyone is Muslim or submits to Islam. So that's why I wanted to get into this. So like I said, that was not a exhaustive explanation of the greater and lesser jihads. And we're going to get in, I'm going to keep bringing this up as we continue on. If you made it this far, thank you guys very much for sticking with me. I know this is going to be a really long video, so hopefully it's worth the wait. I just remind you, if you're enjoying this, if it's beneficial to you, please leave a like. I would appreciate you subscribing and supporting the channel, and maybe even following me over on X. But anyways, let's get back into it. So the Hijrah has occurred. He has moved from Mecca to Medina, and now things begin to change. So, as mentioned, there is a state of tension, a state of conflict that exists in the city of Medina. There are a number of different tribes here, and they're kind of all in this like powder keg, kind of balkanized situation, and some of them are coming to blows. There's a little bit of bloodshed here and there. Others are trying to keep a lid on it, and it's just chaos, or that is about to erupt into more chaos. So the fledgling Muslim community comes in here with Muhammad, and they go, we got to do something about this. So as promised, they give him safe haven, and they actually build the first mosque here in Medina, which I believe still stands to this day. So, but they said, we got to do something about this tension. So, also of note, you have a little bit more diverse. So Mecca was heavily pagan. Medina, as I mentioned way earlier, has a couple of tribes that are actually Jewish here, living among the rest of the Arab tribes, not just in ethnicity, but in religion. So Muslims, Muhammad and his followers kind of get everyone around the table, and they go, all right, guys, we got to figure this out. So Muhammad begins the process of overseeing some negotiations. He oversees the drafting of what becomes either some translated as constitution or charter of Medina. And what this is, just like it sounds like, it is a document, it is an agreement amongst all the parties that establishes order. And not only that, but it recognizes officially Muhammad as a prophet, but also as the leader and kind of the arbiter of this whole arrangement here. So it, among other things, it is a document that resolved intertribal feuds. It provided for the mutual defense, so everyone's going to help defend one another. And it regulates the regulations here and unites them all under Muhammad's leadership. So he kind of becomes like king of Medina in a sense. But yeah, it's not, at this time, it's not him just like coming in and being like, listen, I'm in charge now. It's kind of an agreement. You know, he's this outside party. He's a respected up and coming leader. And so they agree. And so the Muslim community, the Ummah, is officially created here. This is where it begins. They give, like I mentioned, Muhammad gets some political and now some military power. And as long as the parties affected follow this charter, they're granted a level of a good amount of religious tolerance and a good amount of autonomy within their respective little regions, so long as they respect each of the other ones. And it kind of serves as a prototype for the Islamic State, for the caliphate that's to come, not too far into the future. So, all right, so now we've kind of put a lid on all the chaos. Now we have a very interesting development. Now that Muhammad is not just the leader of his own little group that is continuing to grow, religious group, and he's continuing to receive revelations at this point. Sorry, I'm going to check my battery real quick. I don't know how much I got. Okay, we're still good. Sorry. You're seeing the raw stuff here, guys. But he is everything they went and experienced under Mecca is very fresh in their minds. And so the revelations begin to open up the doors for external struggle, lesser jihad, external warfare. And at this point, it is seen as defensive because the Meccans realize that Muhammad has left and they don't want to let him get away so easily. So there begins to be a conflict that arises officially between Mecca and Medina. And so Muhammad begins to conduct raids on trade caravans that are coming from up in Syria or elsewhere and heading down destined for Mecca. Well, he carries out 7 notable raids in the first 18 months of his time in Medina. And it's actually one of these raids that leads to the first significant battle, and that is the Battle of Badr. So Badr. This happens so he arrives in Medina, 622. This battle begins to, lays out the peace, and they begin to conduct their raids. And the Battle of Badr happens in the year 624. And this is a Muslim victory. This is a big moment. This is the first real battle. It's a smaller Muslim force, about a little over 300 fighters, and they're caught off guard. They're surprised by a Meccan relief force, a larger relief force of about 1,000 fighters that have come up to intercept them as they are conducting their raids. So it leads into a big fight, and something like 70 Meccans are killed, while the Muslims only lose a small handful. And so this is a big victory, and it's kind of a rout. And so the Meccans take off, and cheers all around, and we begin to see success not just in the religious sphere, but in the political and economic sphere. And at this time, I want to just remind you that, so in the West, in the United States especially, we have this idea of church and state, and this idea that they should really be separate entities, or that their overlap should be minimal. That's kind of a foreign concept to the Middle East. It's kind of a foreign concept to, there are secular states that have majority Muslim populations. I don't want to ignore that. But for a lot of history, it is very difficult to know where one begins and the other ends, or one ends and the other begins. And this is part of that. So Muhammad, he is kind of the meeting point of these two worlds. So, because who better to lead than the greatest human being who has ever lived, God's chosen apostle. So, as he's getting things going, he's trying to kind of extend the olive branch to the Jewish tribes. There's three notable Jewish tribes. They are the Kainuka, the Nadir, and the Kureza. So, and these three, and he's doing things like a lot of the, well, let me just read what I wrote here. So, despite bringing peace with the constitution of Medina, Muhammad failed to win the respect and recognition of the city's Jewish tribes, who were unimpressed by the similarity of their ways. So, at this point, the Islam, as he's receiving revelations, they've been doing things like they pray toward Jerusalem. They are implementing similar dietary restrictions as the Jews have, such as refraining from eating pork. And he is recognizing them as, quote unquote, the people of the book, that they have a similar religious heritage, even if the Quran and Muhammad had to come along to correct the errors of the Jews. But the Jews do not respond well. They refuse to recognize him as a prophet, and they are also rejecting the validity of his revelations. And Muhammad, that grates on him. It kind of damages his mission a little bit, and he gets more and more frustrated. Well, after the Battle of Badr, he kind of has the momentum that he then moves on the weakest of these three tribes, which is the Kainuka. So after the battle, about a month after, they essentially lay siege. So the different clans kind of live throughout the city in kind of different areas. So they lay siege to this tribe and their area. And soon they are, leading up to this, they had accused them of breaching the Constitution. I don't recall what that is off the top of my head, but they believe that's how they're justifying this attack. And so the Muslims attack this particular tribe, and the tribe books it. So they get out of town, and everything they leave behind is seized by the Muslims, and they disperse it amongst the Ummah. And also their land, I can't remember if they claim these lands or not, but they do at least take their belongings, their possessions, and this kind of sets a precedent for future events. So moving forward, the second notable battle. So you got kind of more of these small skirmishes and stuff going on throughout this whole period, these raids and whatnot. But there's a second notable battle, which is the Battle of Uhud in the following year, 625. So the Quraysh the tribe down in Mecca, were not happy, obviously, at their loss in Badr. Not only did they lose their caravan, but they also lost the battle that ensued afterwards. So they're licking their wounds for a while, and in 625, they come up and attack Medina again. They've got a little bigger army this time. I think it was something like 3,000 warriors. Well, I don't recall all the details of the battle, but the Muslims end up losing. And Muhammad himself is actually wounded in the fighting, sustains like a head or a face wound or something. A couple things, actually. But he doesn't die, obviously. He gets out of there, and this kind of hurts his, as politics go, especially back in the day, the ebb and flow of your favor amongst the people and amongst the other power players in the region. So this kind of hurts him a little bit. Well, he then, soon after this battle, the Nadir tribe, the second Jewish tribe, is accused of plotting to assassinate Muhammad. As there's this fallout after the loss of Uhud. So they are defeated at Medina, but the Quraysh aren't able to conquer and occupy the city. So they don't dislodge Muhammad. He's still there, and they return home. But the Muslims then move against the Nadir tribe. So they kind of do the same thing. They attack them and force them out of the city, and then they seize their assets and their belongings, and those go to support and reward the fighters under Muhammad and support the Ummah. And now that is the second of 3 major Jewish tribes have now been chased out of the city. Well, a couple more years down the line, we have what's called the Battle of the Trench. So as this war has continued to progress between these two cities, there is this contest going on where they are each trying to win the favor and the allegiance of a lot of those Bedouin tribes that I mentioned earlier, that are those nomadic tribes that are out in the rest of Arabia. So different ones are, coming along and pledging themselves to Mecca, or they are pledging themselves to Medina, or some of them even converting to Islam. And so they're getting more and more support. Well, Muhammad has this guy that has a good idea of how to stop cavalry. So they dig, lo and behold, a trench around Medina as a way, which was not a tactic that had been, nomadic tribes always on the move. It wasn't something that they really had seen before. So when the forces, the kind of loose confederacy that Mecca gets together, comes up from the south to, yet again, lay siege to Medina, they're a little better prepared this time. So they have this trench ready, and it ends up only lasting a couple of weeks. And there is some skirmishing going on. It really wasn't a lot of casualties from what I was able to see. And Medina wins. The Muslims win. And the kind of the loose alliance that Mecca got together dissolves, and the different troops go their separate ways with their respective tribes and clans, and the Quraysh yet again are defeated and return back to Mecca to lick their wounds. Well, this is the opportunity that Muhammad takes to move against the final Jewish tribe. So he's had it with their rejections of him, of his revelations, and just the trouble that they caused. So he accuses this tribe of treason, of consorting with and plotting against him and the Muslims with their enemies, the Meccans. So what happens is there's not just the big trench, but there's some other trenches that they build. He gives the order, and they go and round up the men of this tribe, of the Qurayza tribe. And in small group by small group, about 600 to 800 men are brought out of their homes and are beheaded, and their bodies cast into these trenches. And then the women and the children of the tribe are rounded up, and they are sold into slavery. And their assets are seized, just like the other two tribes, and the proceeds from selling them into slavery and all the assets are divided amongst the victors here. And it is kind of a dark note that has been getting you're noticing things getting a little more brutal. And that's yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. So, another controversial note here. In his time in Medina, so with Khadijah, he was monogamous, but after he lost Khadijah, and understandably, he wouldn't be the first person, but he does remarry, and he remarries while he's still in Mecca, some not too terribly long, I think it was like a number of months after he lost Khadijah, and he marries his second wife. Well, as this community is struggling under intense persecution, and then now they are enduring their trials at Medina, he begins to become open to the idea of, polygamy. And so he begins to marry additional wives. And some of these are they kind of have a political bent to them. It's to kind of, continue to unite these different factions. Now that they have notable wives that are under Muhammad, it's kind of like the whole idea of, arranging a marriage between two kingdoms, their prince and their princess, and now they're united, or they're at least allies. Well, he gets up to about somewhere between 9 to 11 wives, and also collects a couple of concubines, somewhere between 1 to 4 concubines. And so he has all these women. And one of them, without going through a whole list, I didn't have time to go through a whole list of them, but there is one in particular that is very controversial, and that's Aisha. So remember, Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, that is Aisha's father, his first successor after he's gone. Aisha, at the time that she is betrothed, and I want to stress this here, this is from hadiths, authentic hadiths. So there is, with our modern mind, our modern mindset, there's a lot of attempts to try to, kind of recontextualize this and make it like, well, it's kind of more like what they did in the day, don't worry, but Aisha is 6 years old when she is betrothed to the Prophet Muhammad. And then the hadith specify that at age 9 years old, he consummates the marriage. In addition to all these other wives. Which, okay, he's not even the only person. There's examples in the Bibles of guys with multiple wives. So I'm not necessarily, at least 1 or 2 of them were like war captives though. So getting into some controversial territory here, but yeah, Aisha is one of the most controversial. The marriage to Aisha is one of the most controversial points in Muhammad's life, at least for non-Muslims. She goes on to be a significant figure, and actually a lot of the hadiths come from her. So she becomes something kind of like a mother to the church, to the Muslims in a regard. And a lot of the hadiths come out of her information that she shares of her interactions and things that she heard from the Prophet. But yeah, they started things off on very interesting terms there. Anyway, so the war continues. So in 628, moving on past that controversy, Muhammad decides it's time for a pilgrimage down to Mecca. So he gets a group together and they start heading down south. Well, he stops nearby, something like 10 miles or so outside the city, because the Meccans learn of his approach. They probably got some scouts out doing their thing. He stops at a place called Al-Hudaybiyah, where Qurayshi emissaries come out to meet him, and they sign a treaty ending hostilities for 10 years. So they say, listen, we're tired of the caravan raids. We're tired of losing battles. This isn't going well for us. This is a waste of time for both. So they negotiate terms and agree to a 10-year peace. And one of those terms is that they grant Muhammad and the Muslims permission to return the following year. So they're not going to allow him that year. But if he accepts the treaty, they can come back next year to conduct their pilgrimage. And they'll even, as long as they come in peacefully, they will vacate the city, and for 3 days they will be allowed to conduct their pilgrimage and do all the things that they need to do. So they agree. So the two parties agree, but their little contest of influence continues. So the different tribes are still picking sides. A little later that year, in the year 628, Muhammad returns, and there is a place, back to the map, So he's down in Medina. They sign their treaty, and he goes back up, down in Mecca. He goes back up to Medina, and he's like, well, let's get the boys together. There's this place up here called Khaybar. Looks like probably 100 miles or so north of Medina. And Muhammad's not a big fan of Jews at this point. So he goes up to Khaybar, which is where a Jewish community lives, at the oasis of Khaybar. And they lay siege to Khaybar. And I can't remember exactly how long it was, but they capitulate and they agree to pay tribute to Medina. So it was like the following year, they were going to give like half of their harvest to the Medinans and to the Muslims. So they accept it. So now you have a little vassal state. So there is this influence slowly, steadily growing while Muhammad is still alive, under Muhammad's leadership. So now it's 629, and the first pilgrimage is underway. Muhammad is taking a group of about 2,000 Muslims, and I should specify. So this is seen, from what I was seeing, it's a minor pilgrimage. So the first true full pilgrimage won't happen until later, but this is kind of the precursor. It's kind of the test run. So he leads a group of about 2,000 Muslims down to Mecca, and they, take a lot of their weapons off, and they enter the city peacefully. And the Quraysh are outside the city, chilling on a nearby hill, and they kind of let them have the run of things for 3 days. So they complete their what's called the tawaf, which is circling around the Kaaba. So they go to the Kaaba. He does not cleanse it at this point, because that almost certainly would have restarted the war, and probably not at a opportune moment. But they do conduct their they do this thing where they circle around the Kaaba multiple times, and they do some other religious things there. And then they go their own way. They head back up to Medina. They say, thank you very much. We'll see you next year. Later this year, in the year 629, I know we're creeping along here. I promise things are going to speed up, but there is something significant that goes on. So remember, you have these superpowers up here, and they're kind of, I'm sure they have their scouts. There's reports as, trades going in and out, and they're carrying stories up to these superpowers of these happenings in Mecca and Medina, and this new religion going on. So word gets to Muhammad, Muhammad's sending out messengers to not just all these different tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, but he's also sending them up into these other lands, into these other kingdoms and empires. And the Ghassanids, sorry, I keep referring to my map here. He sends a messenger up here, and that messenger tries to convert them to Islam. Says, hey, you need to follow the right way. Well, the Ghassanids are having none of it, and maybe they were trying to impress their Roman overlords. But they kill the guy. They kill the messenger. Not Muhammad. They kill Muhammad's messenger. And Muhammad does not take that well. So, understandably so. So, Muhammad sends a war party. So, he's not leading this one. But he does rally 3,000 fighters and puts them under a couple of different commanders and sends them northward. And that small army ends up in the first official engagement between Muslim forces in the year 629 and Christian forces of combination of the Ghassanids and the Eastern Roman Empire. So they have a much larger force that is in the area. As you can see, they get involved in what is called the Battle of Mu'tah. So that's right there. So that's where Jerusalem would be. So Mu'tah is over here on the other side of the Jordan River. So right there, kind of right on the border of like Ghassanid territory and Eastern Roman territory proper. It is a defeat. However, it's kind of they make the best of a bad situation, because all three Muslim commanders fall in this battle. One of them in very fantastic fashion, where I guess he had like both of his arms lopped off, but was still like holding on to the standard, like kind of with his chin. Crazy, crazy details. And then an important figure for moving forward, a man by the name of Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid, remember that name. Takes over once these three fall. He takes over. So he was not in command, but he takes over, takes command rallies the force and conducts an orderly retreat because they're losing to the superior force. So he gets the survivors out of there. Muslim sources say it's something only like, only 15 to 16 people died. It's probably something more like half the force, because the description of this battle is, it was a battle. Like, people were fighting. It wasn't like a little skirmish, like, especially when you're hearing the commanders just getting absolutely like shredded. But so Khalid will be a very important figure, ends up becoming a very successful general in the future. But he takes command of forces and leads them in a retreat. Well, even though it is tactically a defeat, it becomes a moral victory, because this up-and-coming Muslim state, Islamic State, just getting on its feet, just went toe-to-toe with one of the superpowers of their era. So now they got bragging rights. They're like, okay, yeah, I lost, but like, how many major armies have you fought in your lifetime? So that's claims that a lot of these tribes cannot claim. So moving on, sorry. So also the same year, word gets back to Muhammad that some of their allies are attacked by some of Mecca's allies, which he sees as a violation of the treaty, which probably is, understandably so. And so he renounces the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Anyways, renounces the treaty. So now war's back on. War's back on the menu, boys. So early next year, 630, he rounds up an army of some 10,000 fighters, much bigger than before. And they begin a march down to Mecca. It's time to end this. Probably intending to lay siege to the city. But as they get close, Mecca's like, okay, we're cooked, boys. So they actually approach him before the battle begins, and they sue for peace. And finally, Mecca capitulates to the Prophet Muhammad. And in return for their peaceful surrender, he grants them amnesty and their agreement to submit to him and his authority. And it's at this time that he enters the city and then cleanses the Kaaba. So then goes in and removes all the idols, and doesn't just like they're out there smashing idols, him and the boys. And notably, interestingly, he covers, one exception is he covers a painting or an image of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus with his cloak, and says, hey, all the rest, but leave this one. This is, Islam has an interesting relationship to Jesus. Obviously they don't see him how Christians see him, but they do have an interesting reverence that isn't really seen anywhere else. So I do want to acknowledge that. But now, you have not just Medina, but now Mecca. This whole region is beginning to grow, and you got this little vassal up here. And all these other tribes throughout the region are more and more pledging their allegiance to Muhammad. So we have the very beginning of the Islamic State here, now still under the lifetime of Muhammad. So this wasn't something that happened later. Muhammad hears rumor that there's an army gathering. So he hears basically that like the Romans are like, who are these people to pick a fight with us? So they get reports that supposedly there's an army that's growing up here back in the Ghassanid Kingdom, with the intent to most likely press into the Arabian Peninsula and to quash what's going on, this kind of growing threat. So he makes an announcement to the Ummah and says, listen, we're about to embark on something very, very significant. There are enemies gathering on our borders, beyond our borders, with the intent to do us harm. So it is time to endure some hardship together. So he rallies 30,000. So there was 10,000 going down to Mecca. He rallies 30,000 fighters into an army and makes a hard march up north, under blistering sun and, all the austere life of an army on the move. So they get up there And when they get to an area around Tabuk, so this is known as the Expedition of Tabuk, or Expedition to Tabuk, and what then was considered like the borders of Syria, the army had already withdrawn. So whatever force was gathering there had already moved on. So it ends up being a quote-unquote bloodless conquest, because while he's there, it says the prophet stayed about 10 to 20 days, scouting, negotiating alliances, and securing treaties and protection pacts with the local Christian Arab tribes who agreed to pay jizya. So jizya is something we're going to come back to, but this is a tax, basically kind of like how K-Bar had to agree to pay a bunch of their harvest to Medina. It's probably lower than this, but the jizya is a special tax to an Islamic government by a non-Muslims, particularly of like Christian or Jewish identity, with maybe a couple others. But anyways, we'll talk about that more in the next episode. So in exchange for Muslim protection and autonomy. So now, kind of in line with the color scheme you see going on here, Muhammad has this state that is growing. And down here you've got this did belong to the Sassanid Empire at one point, but the Sassanid leader perishes, and you have the kingdom down there. The governor converts to Islam, and they end up also throwing their lot in with Muhammad. And so he's getting a lot of momentum going on here. And sorry. So now we are at, finally, the year 632. And this is the first full pilgrimage. So Muhammad, where there was only 2,000 before, so Muhammad's home base continues to be Medina. So it was Mecca up until the migration from Mecca to Medina, and then Muhammad lives the rest of his life out in Medina. So that's why it's only split. It's not the Meccan verses, the Medinan verses, and then the late Meccan verses. It's Mecca, then Medina. However, he does conduct these pilgrimages. So now is the first proper full pilgrimage. So he rounds up in about March of 632, gets together a group of at least 100,000 Muslims, and they conduct a full pilgrimage down to Mecca, and they do all the activities that Muslims participate in today when they conduct their Hajj, their pilgrimage to Mecca. And he also delivers what comes to be known as his farewell address or his farewell sermon. And I didn't really have time to go into the weeds on this, so I apologize. This is probably something that would have been really good to really dig into. But he does deliver basically like a final, like real public address at this time. And then he returns. And just a few months later, on June 8th, or leading up to June 8th, he begins to fall ill. And he finally passes away on June 8th of 632. And the Ummah is devastated. So, that was a lot. And that's why I said we will get to the rest of it next time. This episode is probably going to be over an hour. It's going to be my first. So, but I appreciate you guys sticking with me. So just to re-summarize very, very briefly, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was born fully human in 570 in Mecca. God protects, so this is a thing with prophets that Muslims believe, that God protects him from serious sin. So it's not that he was completely and utterly sinless, but he was preserved from serious sins. So, obviously things like murder and theft would be examples of that. And he is a monotheist before the prophet, a Hanif before the prophethood. Marries Khadijah at age 25, to whom he is faithful and monogamous. He works as a shepherd, then as a caravan trader, and then becomes a prophet, frightened at his first revelation, but then he is encouraged and enters into his preaching. Preaches peacefully, devout themes privately, then publicly, then endures persecution by the Quraysh tribe and experiences the night journey. So, and then he migrates, has the Hijra from Mecca to Medina in year 622, and that begins the Islamic calendar. Then he gains political and military power. He begins conducting raids and battles against the Meccans and their internal enemies in Medina. Becomes polygamous, collecting wives. This isn't all exactly in perfect order. He becomes polygamous, collecting wives and concubines in at least one of a unsettling age. And then this been talking for a while, I'm tired. Crescendos into greater conquest until Mecca finally capitulates, steadily gaining power, extending beyond his homeland. So, and in the continuing to shape the religion, pilgrimages begin until he finally passes away in Medina in the year 632. So that is Muhammad's life. And the reason I went into so much detail is it is so important to understand who he is, because that's going to set the pace for what Islam is and what it does over the course of history and what Muslims continue to do today and continue to believe today. So let's take a brief look at the life of Jesus of Nazareth as Christians understand him. We'll recover a couple of these details to show where it's common between Muslims and Christians, but briefly. So, Jesus. We just gave the summary of Muhammad. Jesus is born to the Virgin Mary, so he does not have an earthly father. It is an immaculate conception. Mary is impregnated visited by the angel, and then she is made pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Not in a carnal way. It says the Spirit just passes over her and implants Christ into her, implants Christ in her womb. And, sorry, not to give weird details there. And so he's born in Bethlehem, and according to Christian theology, he is fully man, but he is also fully God. And he is, in fact, the prophesied Messiah, prophesied in the Old Testament. And this God taking human form, he is God incarnate. So that's a key word here, incarnation. So that is what Christians believe. He's raised in the town of Nazareth by Mary and his earthly adopted father Joseph, who was a carpenter. So it's reasonable to conclude that he himself would also be taught that trade. So Christ is a carpenter. And as a boy, he shows extraordinary wisdom, including teaching in the temple at age 12. And that's really like the only story we get of Christ's childhood is that thing where he goes missing, but he's actually hanging out in the temple, teaching and talking with the other Jewish elders and stuff in there. But the Quran shares a lot of other, I don't want to overstate it, but shares a few other stories about Christ's childhood, about him like standing up in his crib and talking to Mary, even though he's a baby, an infant, of him crafting like clay birds and bringing them to life because he's God, even though the Muslims don't believe he's God. But and him, one of his childhood friends like falls off a roof and he brings him back to life. And these are things that are not in the Christian scriptures. These are in heretical texts, heretical gospels that the Gnostics follow. We'll talk about that another day. Probably not in this series. Gnostics don't really have a lot to do with our current state in the United States. But anyways, around age 30, Christ is baptized by John the Baptist, and we get this image of, God the Father recognizing Christ and, verbally, telling those witnessing that this is my son, in him I am well pleased. And then you see the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove descend on Christ. So you get that Trinitarian picture there, and begins his public ministry. So ministry, for about 3 years or so, he teaches about the kingdom of God. He performs miracles all the time, healing the sick, raising the dead, calming storms, feeding multitudes. He forgives sins and gathers disciples. So that's an important note, because that is something that these religions believe only God can do. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all agree that only God can forgive sins. So the fact that Christ forgave people's sins, it's for the crowd that says, like, oh, well, Christ never claimed to be God. Well, he did things that only God could do. So, yeah. Anyways, he lives a sinless life. So he's preserved from sin through the Immaculate Conception. And from his birth until his death, he lives a sinless, completely sinless life. And that is explicitly stated in the New Testament. It's not really stated that way in the Quran, but the Quran does withhold any examples of him committing any sin at all. Has the triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, where he's welcomed as a king. But later that week, he conducts the Last Supper with his disciples, where he shares a final meal and institutes the Lord's Supper. until he is betrayed, arrested, put on trial, and then ultimately crucified, and is buried in death. And this is where Christianity and Islam kind of departs, because they don't believe he was crucified. They believe it only appeared like he was crucified. I think some even say that it was Judas or somebody else that was put in his place to look like it was Christ. But we do know from extra biblical sources, from other historical sources, that if we know anything about Jesus Christ, we know that he existed and that he was crucified under the Roman authorities. So, and of course, as a Christian, we believe that he, on the third day, rose. He didn't stay dead, he rose from death, conquering death and defeating sin, and then appeared to his disciples and continued to teach them and appear to them and comfort them over a course of 40 days until he ascends into heaven, with the promise that with delivering the Great Commission to Christians to go into all the world, making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to live and obey the things that I have commanded you, and I will be with you until the end of this age. And that he delivers that promise that he will. That's at the end of Matthew there that I was quoting, or as close to memory as I could quote. But Christians believe he will come again bodily, that it's not just a spiritual thing. That for now, we're kind of in this middle period where the kingdom is spiritual. There are physical elements to that, but it is mostly spiritual. Whereas by comparison, the Islamic state is a very physical thing. More on that later. So a direct comparison between these two. So places where Muslims agree. They agree that, we're doing a direct comparison here. So this is between Muhammad and Jesus. So birth. Muhammad was born naturally, whereas Christ was born of a virgin nature. So Muhammad is fully man, whereas Jesus is God incarnate in human form. Muhammad was preserved from major sins, whereas Jesus was completely sinless. So this is not the Muslim view of both of these. This is the Muslim view of Muhammad versus the Christian view of Jesus. The ministry, both begin peaceful, though Muhammad's miracles are mostly lacking. And I don't mean that as like necessarily a derisive statement, but he's not really mentioned to have performed a whole lot of miracles, with exceptions like the night journey. But Jesus frequently and publicly performs his miracles, publicly and privately. Muhammad rejected the previous stages of the faith, Judaism and Christianity, whereas Jesus came to fulfill the law. So Muhammad, from the point he was a monotheist, he avoids committing to Christianity or Judaism. He doesn't think that's the right way. That's not the religion that that was passed down to us through Abraham. However, Christ, that was not his approach. He came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law so that he could be that perfect sinless sacrifice for us. Relationships. Muhammad was married, was monogamous in his first marriage until she passed away, but then was later polygamous with some questionable morality in there. Jesus, obviously this is where I'm getting more of my own perspective here. Jesus was never married. Sorry, Mormons. We'll talk about it another day, but Jesus was never married. As we approach the end, Muhammad's ministry begins peaceful, but then turns violent when he comes into power and begins commanding an army. Now, that does begin defensively, but it seems to kind of begin to take an offensive nature. Whereas Jesus was peaceful from beginning to end. He actively, maybe with certain exceptions, like him overturning the temple tables, but that wasn't leading an army. That was cleansing the temple of things that we ought not be doing. Jesus actively declined his followers' calls to crown him king and approached Jerusalem with his mission in mind. And then Muhammad dies of natural or unnatural causes. Some people think it might have been a result of him having been poisoned, but he does fall ill and die of natural causes as any man, whereas Jesus was betrayed, tormented, crucified, sacrificed for all of mankind, and then rose from death 3 days later, victorious, and ascends to the Father with a promise to return as our King. Some details where we agree. So we both agree on the virgin birth. We both agree that Christ performs signs and wonders and miracles. They both address Christ as the Messiah, although that understanding is a little bit different between the two. They both recognize him as a prophet. Christians believe he's more than that, but he is a prophet, among other things. They recognize him as the Word of God. So both describe Jesus as a word from God. We Christians would say he's the Word of God. Both believe he ascended into heaven. Christians, of course, believe this is after his death and resurrection. Muslims believe he ascended alive. And then both believe that he will return again to the earth for judgment and to establish truth and righteousness. And he is, of course, a highly revered figure, which in Christianity is an understatement. He's not just highly revered, he is the very object of our worship. But that is how so I'm getting really tired here. I've been talking for a long time. But those are the details that both sides have in common. And I lay that out because, like I said, I'm going to be doing a comparison between the two, Christianity and Islam, because obviously I believe Christianity has an intimate history here in the United States. We can argue another day about whether or not we are in fact a Christian nation, but we have at the very least been a predominantly Christian nation in the identity of her population. And that has begun to change in recent decades. Is that good or bad? Well, we're going to talk about that. I obviously don't think that's a good thing, but we're going to talk about why another day. But I hope this was very beneficial for you guys. I know it has been very, very long. I did want to share just a couple notes really quick before I close out here. So all of this, keep in mind, so this mini-series on Islam that I've been doing is leading up to is part of a larger series that I'm calling the American Cold War. So, you've heard phrases like the culture wars or, fighting woke or whatever. There's a very real tension going on in this country. And part of my motivation for starting this series is I wanted to do some research so that I understood first and foremost, but then also so I could share it and try to communicate it in a way that people find a little entertaining. I try to let my personality be a little fun. I think I'm a decently entertaining guy, but that's for you guys to decide. But I want all of this, each of these topics, so Islam or any of the other topics, which I'm going to go over some of what's to come, as I cover videos on them, I am leading it all ultimately to a 3-part question. And that is, number 1, what is the thing I'm talking about's history in the United States? Number 2, how is it affecting us today? And number 3, what place and future, if any, should it have in America? And I use that term, should, very deliberately because as I have stated before and will continue to state, I am not unbiased. This has not been an unbiased presentation of Islam. I try to be fair, I try to be accurate, but I am a Christian, first and foremost. Then I am an American and someone who would describe themselves as a patriot. I think we are definitely not a perfect nation. We definitely have things even today that need to be changed and improved. A lot of things. But I love the country that God chose for me to be born into. I want the best. I pray for her and I hope for her citizens and her as a nation to succeed, to prosper, to live peaceful, God-honoring lives, or people, as long as they're willing to follow the rules, can be unbelievers here too. But I do believe that Christianity should have a predominant place in at least the influence of our ways here in the United States. We're not just an economic zone. And part of truth is my goal, but I do offer commentary, obviously, in this. As I've stated, I want to avoid straw men. I want to create a legitimate case of why I critique Islam or why I critique this or that or the other thing. I'm not always going to be perfect about it. I'm going to get things wrong. And if I get anything egregiously wrong, let me know. And I will address it if need be. But a lot of kind of what I was getting at here. Let me find that other notes that I was wanting to make sure I covered here. But there's this, as I've been doing my research, I've been really running into things. So with topics like jihad, they really emphasize the whole, like, it's defensive in nature. And what I'm getting to in the next episode is, okay, so you're saying this doctrine, at least when we're talking about the lesser jihad, this doctrine is supposedly only defensive. But in 100 years, Islam goes from little Mecca and Medina, just this little corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and rapidly conquers 2/3 of the Christian world and a lot of the rest of the world. In the West, exactly 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there is the Battle of Tours happening in the heart of France. Spain has been conquered by Muslim armies. And Muslim armies have marched through southern France and are getting within striking range of Paris, in the very heart, north-central heart of France. And it's only their defeat there that stops their advance. And some people try to downplay that, like, oh, it's just raiding parties. Maybe, but there were tens of thousands of, Muslim warriors that were rampaging across the countryside and taking whatever they want. Then you have, of course, the Holy Land and all the way through Persia, out into, starting to reach out into India and reach the very edge of what is today China. Islam expands across, and then, of course, they push all the way up the border up to almost to Constantinople. And this enormous swath, all across North Africa, enormous swath of territory is conquered in 1 century. Back then, maybe that'd be one thing today. That'd be slow by today's standards, but we have freaking supersonic jets. We have nuclear weapons. We have planes that can take us across a continent in 2 hours. They didn't have that 1,400 years ago. That is insane that they were able to do that and be more or less united under a single ideology, a single religion. Now, there were lots of internal fighting and squabbles too, but what I'm getting at here is how does that happen with a purely defensive doctrine here? So we're going to continue to explore jihad going forward. And full, fairness, there is an internal component. I do believe that there is the greater jihad that is very similar to something that I would relate to as a Christian. But it's inseparable that there is also an external component that oftentimes, even though it's the lesser jihad, becomes the primary focus of the Islamic State in continuing to expand its borders. And admittedly, the expansion of Islam itself I thought it was more like they were converting as they went along. It was more so, maybe there were instances of that here and there, but it was mostly they would conquer an area and it would be ruled by Muslims, by Arab Muslims, but then they would implement their systems of Sharia in its full force. And over time, over centuries, people gradually became Muslim more and more over time. So it wasn't that everyone became Muslim in the city of Alexandria overnight. That's not what happened. They just got new rulers and they had a new ruling class that was put in over them. And over time set the conditions to kind of gradually pressure people into becoming Muslim. So, but I say all that because there's this, where's my notes? I want to make sure. I heard it described as this deconstructionist bias. And this is part of why I'm wanting to start doing direct comparisons as I proceed between Islam and Christianity. And it won't just be Islam. I'm going to be doing this with everything I talk about. That's kind of my motivation for my channel. My channel is an intersection of faith and politics. And, each have their place, but they do overlap. My political views ultimately grow out of my religious convictions. So this deconstructionist bias is religions are what the faithful make them. That's one point of it. And I think that is true sometimes, but it is not the default by any means. I would really push back on that idea because, like I just mentioned, Muslims care more about the example and life of Muhammad than just about anything else, other than worshiping God, obviously. But to them, that is one and the same. Submitting to Muhammad is submitting to God. Likewise, over on the Christian side of the aisle, we may have different denominations and different traditions, but we are all trying to live by Christ's example the best way that we can. We're all trying to understand Christ's teachings. That the idea that somehow Christ's, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this concept of religions are what the faithful make them, but to me it kind of says like, oh, well, your beliefs of Christ have developed over time. No, we're studying the same scriptures that were written in the same century as Christ's life and trying to understand them better and better every day. And yeah, maybe some people move further away from what is the truth, and some people are moving closer to that. But it's just, I don't know. I just disagree with the statement. And then there's this whole moral relativity quality of all religions are path to the same God or to the universe, or no religion is better than another. And I think these are insane claims. They are it's such a ridiculous, self-contradicting claim to say that, because I literally just gave you examples. Christians believe Jesus is God incarnate. Muslims do not. And there are ramifications of that. Muslims believe I am committing shirk because I worship Jesus Christ. Muslims believe they don't believe Christ is God. They believe God is God. Singular, not a trinity. Only one of those, and to elevate anyone else to that level, like the Christians do, is shirk, the greatest and gravest sin in Islam, of which I will be burning in Muslim hellfire for, according to their beliefs. So one of those things is true. This is not like, oh, Muslims are right, but also Christians are right. That cannot be the case. What I'm leading to is that this is moral cowardice, first of all, and a religion, which is a system of ideas, is either true or it is false. Either one religion is true and all the rest are false, or no. And I'm talking ultimately here. Obviously, there might be like little details. So like me as a Lutheran, like there may be certain detail. Oh, okay, like the Catholics were right. Like it was transubstantiation. I was just being stubborn, which is pretty close to what I believe anyways, but splitting hairs here. But still, it doesn't change that we still worship the same God. We still have a lot of the same practices, even if it's slightly different forms. We still ultimately submit to the same body of ideas, but a religion ultimately is either true or false. Either one religion's true, all the rest are false, or all religions are false. There is no possibility. Either Christianity is true and everything else is a lie and must be interpreted through the lens of Christianity, or Islam is true and all that respect there. Or neither is true and we really do just live in a materialistic universe, or something else is true that we don't even know of yet. So I threw my money in, my soul in with Christianity, and that's where I'm going to stay. But anyways, the last thing I wanted to talk about before I finally wrap this video up is that there are a few things to come. So in this American Cold War series, some of the other things I want to discuss, it's going to be at least probably 2 or 3 more episodes on Islam, but I promise I do want to get to a stopping point sooner or later. But some of the other religions and denominations I want to look at and really consider into our current national situation is Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, so basically all the major religions, Roman Catholicism, Mormonism, Orthodoxy, so I put it that way for Eastern Orthodox as well as the other, Oriental and so on, mainline Protestantism, evangelicalism, the New Age stuff, and even Satanism. And that's not an exhaustive list by any means, but that's the ones that came to my mind. I want to look into political parties and movements specifically. So, of course, the Republicans and Democrats, look into the Libertarian Party, progressivism, the Make America Great Again movement, the America First movement, the Democratic Socialists of America, and probably another range of movements and parties as I can come up with them, as I think they have some relevance to our current situation. And then I want to also look into some ideologies in different systems of ideas, to include capitalism, Marxism in both its lesser socialist and greater communist varieties, fascism, what fascism actually is, and not what people malign people like me as being, feminism, globalism, nationalism, liberalism, conservatism, materialism, secularisms, all the isms, making me feel autism, and much, much more. So obviously I have embarked upon a tremendous gargantuan project here that, God willing, will not just take weeks and months, but likely will take years, and hopefully will give you guys some very good information, will help to teach me and test my own knowledge and compare my own beliefs against other systems of ideas. And you know what? I love learning. I love learning, and I love trying to turn around and pass on knowledge. So thank you guys oh, and those all may not get their own standalone episodes. Some of them may be lumped in together as appropriate, but some may get multiple episodes, just kind of like Islam's getting right now, if I feel it is warranted. So at some point I will, as we get closer to midterms later this year, I am going to shift focus back towards my videos on how I think Christians ought to be considering their votes issue by issue, and why I think more times than not that is going to be for a conservative candidate. You can disagree and let me know, but that will come. I don't know when I'll revert to that, but for at least the next few months, probably at least the next 2 to 3 months, I will continue on this path. If not, who knows? What is it? February? So maybe as it gets close to kind of the middle of summer, about June or July, I'll start kind of looking into whether or not, or what I want to do there. But anyways, I think this is well over an hour. I've been breaking this up into pieces, so we'll see how much I have actually been rambling for. But God bless you guys if you've gotten to this point. Please like, subscribe, follow me on X or here on YouTube. And I love you guys very much. Thank you so much. Leave a comment. Let me know how I did. Constructive criticism is always appropriate. I do leave the comment sections open, so if you just want to tell me what a horrible, evil, twisted person I am, by all means, leave those as well. But thank you guys very, very much. My channel name is more ironic than I could have ever possibly imagined, but you have a wonderful, I guess today's Saturday. It's going to be late Saturday night by the time I finally get this posted, but we will see you guys next time. Take care.